Can I read you this story from a former student? This student says, look, I'll talk to you. I'll tell you what you need to know. As long as I'm able to stay completely anonymous, I've seen what the church does to people who speak out against them. I have too many friends who've had their reputations and careers ruined for speaking out. And I don't want to go through that.
We've not just been under attack. We've come under absolute assault.
The bullying, the intimidation, the fear, it's very, very real.
We're in a spiritual battle, possibly bigger than ever before.
Hillsong and Brian Houston's endgame is really about transforming society. They really do believe that they need to conquer earth in order to make heaven on earth.
Brian Houston, unfortunately, will stop at nothing.
I encourage you, in fact, to focus on the church you know and not be distracted by all the devil's efforts.
I think that it is a bit of a culture of protect the brand at all costs, and whatever it takes to achieve that.
He's not protecting Hillsong Church, he's protecting the Hillsong empire.
The best is yet to come. Amen. I sat at a desk one day. We were 10 years old as a church. I would have been 39 years of age. And I was inspired. I felt like I wanted to write down what was in me in terms of the dream for our church. Many people here you've heard of the church that I see.
The church that I see is a church of influence.
The church that I see is now like a mission statement. I talked about many other things that relate to our church now, including television, the influence of the worship, the Hillsong International Leadership College.
Not only do they have the church, they also have this, what they tout as a college, basically a university kind of model that is designed to bring young students, young people from around the world and from Australia into the Hillsong family.
The church that I see is a church so committed to the raising, the training and empowering of a leadership generation that all its ministries are consumed with this goal.
It, I believe, exploits young, vulnerable people.
So Big Tobacco knows this. If you can get people hooked while they're still not mature enough, while their values aren't completely formed and their decision-making processes aren't perfect, Big Tobacco knows you can get them for life, and so does Hillsong.
My name is Yolandi and I attended Hillsong College.
My name is Elizabeth Curette and I attended Hillsong International Leadership College from 2005 to 2008.
My name is Bailey Krozik. I attended Hillsong College from July 2017 to July 2021. I did not know about Hillsong Church before I decided to go to college. I actually came down from my room one day and my mom had the Hillsong channel playing on the TV. And they happened to be playing an episode of Hillsong, The College Experience, which is giving you a little taste of what it would look like to go to Hillsong College.
This is Hillsong International Leadership College. Our aim is to develop your gifts and skills. Hillsong College, where God prepares you for your future.
I was studying film in Cape Town and I remember they dropped a DVD at our college which was a Hillsong DVD, a worship DVD of missionaries going around and filming, in these different countries, and it really spoke to me in a big way. And I think that really tugged on my heart. And that's one of the things that drew me to Hillsong College. I wanted to change the world and Hillsong wanted to change the world, and I thought those two things fit together.
I knew I wanted to go to Bible college, but I did not want to go anywhere that didn't acknowledge dance as a form of worship, as a form of just gifting from God. So then I connected with Hillsong because I was heavily involved with Campus Crusade for Christ at Ball State, and I was on the worship team. Had a great experience, and we did a lot of Hillsong music. And I just found it great. And so I did what I knew to do, was pray and ask God for confirmation, and he did that.
They go above and beyond to make Hillsong College look as enticing and just full of opportunities and creativity as possible. And how, as an 18-year-old, could you not look at that and say, whoa, this is unlike any other church community I've ever been involved in before?
Hold on. Is that a danceable song? Yeah. Okay, that's good. Keep going.
They told me, you can make a real change if you come to Hillsong.
I felt it was God's calling on my life.
I thought this was going to be the beginning of my life. But from day one, the moment I landed, the second that I landed, it was a disaster. I had my luggage lost, and so I had no clothes. I told myself, just be grateful you're here. You're here. It's going to work out. It's going to work out. Have faith. But I was overwhelmed, and I had a veterans type grant. My dad is a disabled Vietnam veteran, and that check was sent out to Hillsong College because the first check needed to be to the institution, and the institution needed to render that over to me because a portion of that would cover my tuition expenses, and then the rest would be for living. And when I got there, that check was nowhere to be found. The Christian church that I would attending at home, they were a safe space, and if I needed anything, they were there. And I literally thought that that was the same experience I was going to have at Hillsong Church and Hillsong College, and they had very little empathy. It was dismissed right away. They don't want to hold any responsibility to how you're feeling, to your experiences, because that's your own journey. That's your journey with God. It must be with you. Or, you know, we all go through suffering and persecution, and this is part of the Christian life. And a lot of people probably will say, well, why didn't you follow up with it? Well, at the time you're thinking, well, you know, let me just forgive. You let it go, to not harbor any resentment, not harbor any bitterness. You need to be grateful that you're here. God is going to cover you. He's going to figure it out. I felt lost, and eventually I lost weight because I didn't have enough food to eat. It got to the point where it was so difficult. I had roommates, some very reluctantly, and one in particular who helped me out when she was even struggling herself.
I would say the biggest red flag moment was when we are starting to sign up for classes. We have to get green lighted or red lighted for the working with children's check. How they framed the working with children's check was, we need to brief your background and your history with if you've had sex, if you've done drugs, if you were drinking, any of this within the last year. And if you have, then you're not fit to work with children, and so we're going to allocate you to another serving area. But I don't think that was entirely their motivation for creating this screening process. We are giving them very, very personal, intimate details and information about our lives that very quickly became something that was held over us and they could use against us. It was not just about the working with children check. It started affecting, would you get platform opportunities? Were you just looked down upon by your peers? You would have to go through extra classes. You just were not given enough opportunities. So I actually have my journal from when I first got to college. It was July 23rd, 2017, and I had written, "I'm feeling very nervous about meeting the pastors. They're going to ask me if I have done drugs or alcohol or sex within the past year, and I'm still so ashamed of what I did. I don't want to tell them, but I don't want to lie. I just want to move on from it. However, they may be able to offer wise advice. I just still feel so ashamed." And so obviously I had a lot of fear and shame because before coming to college, I was sexually assaulted. And up until that point, I had not experienced anything sexual. And after that, I was devastated because I felt so impure. Because of this culture I had grown up in, it was my fault for putting myself in that situation. I was carrying this immense guilt and shame with me to college because now I have to tell them that this happened to me, and that might hinder me already right off the bat what I'm allowed to do and what opportunities I'll be able to partake in. And that was a very scary feeling. I went in and I sat down with this woman, and I started to get really worked up because of how ashamed I was, how traumatic that was for me. Even though I was using language like, I didn't want to do it, he forced me to drink, I was pretty much unconscious. Nobody told me that I was sexually assaulted. Pretty much what Hillsong told me was, it's okay, you've repented, you've come clean for what you did, and that's not what your heart truly wants or reflects, so we're not going to red light you. And they still never brought it up to me that it wasn't my fault. Everybody just told me that I did a bad thing, but I'm now forgiven. It's very upsetting when I think about sitting there with an older, wiser woman and they didn't help me. I do believe that is also a control thing. Your record of if you've been green lighted, if you've been red lighted, the special classes you've had to take, all of these things are recorded and they're kept. It's always over your head. Looking back on this experience, I do believe that it is the beginning of a brainwashing process. It's just very, very messed up.
One thing that really bothered me was the fact that you can't start your first year of college or your second or third year at college without an NDA. You can't share recordings, you can't share class introductions, you can't share stories with family and friends, and you basically sign your rights away. I never signed the NDA, but I think other kids, they don't know anything about NDAs. They'll just think, oh, it's another electronic form to sign. In the current Hillsong group, there are people saying, I didn't even know that I signed this. Like, how did I not even know that I signed this? I was 18 or 17 when I got this, you know, so it's frightening.
I've spoken to student after student after student from the Hillsong College, and there's a consistent pattern there. They're all required to sign non-disclosure agreements, which are then used to threaten them by Hillsong if it appears that they might come out and tell the truth about what happened during their student experience. And the threat of a legal action being brought against somebody by an institution as wealthy and powerful as Hillsong sends an enormous chilling effect.
If you were a church that is open and trusting, why would you get your members to sign an NDA? unless you're hiding something, of course.
When you begin to break down the money aspect of college, that's when even more of these cult-like tendencies start to show, because of the sheer amount of free labor they were extracting from all of these kids.
The amount of investment, the time is so gross that it's very alarming of how they get away with it.
You're required to serve at the church during the weekend. You're required to serve at the college in the chapels, and you're required to serve in your internship. I was editing their programs for free as part of my college. No matter where you were serving, on the makeup team, driver's team, refresh team, which were the people that would just clean everything. Someone's practicum for the semester would just be cleaning the church. But it was, at the end of the day, all just adding up to free labor.
I'd spend the equivalent of a work week at Hillsong for free. Near the end, it was like, I don't have the capacity. You guys are gonna have to hire a venue guy to run your lighting, because I'm exhausted and you guys aren't gonna pay me. Well, we don't wanna pay somebody. Can't you train more people up? I'm sorry, that's your first sentence was the real problem. I don't wanna pay somebody.
It's very strategic. Hillsong Church, Hillsong College is about replicating minions, mini robots, because robots are not going to question anything.
Brian Houston says everybody that comes into our church is equal is simply not true. I mean, Brian Houston is a liar. He lies constantly for his own gain. Again, you can't think about this as church. You have to think about it as corporation. He's the high-level manager of the entire organization.
I watched how some of the teams were here this morning at 5 a.m., volunteers, not being paid for at 5 a.m. They got here at 5 o'clock in the morning, they've worked all day, they'll still be here when we all go home at night, and there are people here who, since the day this church started, have done that every single weekend of their lives, and we can thank God for them, because they're amazing. They're amazing. But I also believe that that's the kind of attitude that can cause people to see their own dreams come true.
They make it seem like this is good experience for you, and so that's the mindset you are holding on to, but really they are just using you.
It's all about the God of money. It's not really, it's using God and Christ as a marketing piece.
One of the things was expected from us to send overseas to Australia some percentage from our Ukrainian church offering to support, I don't know, some senior pastor global fund. When we asked what is this fund for, nobody would answer.
They were expecting huge honorariums from the Ukrainian church. For the speaker to come to our conferences, they would invite those people, but it was on my shoulder to find money to pay for those people. You cannot treat the church in Ukraine the same way you treat the church in Australia or Sweden or America. It is a struggling country. Normal salary is $300 per month. But I was asked and pushed to pay from $3,000 to $5,000 for the speaker and between $12,000 and $15,000 to pay for business class seats, 5-star hotel.
So we understand,
it was very difficult.
We could not do it. If this is a culture and it's acceptable. We are not judging this. We're just saying we were not able to comply with everything what was expected from us. We receive so many emails with so much pressure.
You feel the threat, you feel bullying.
We were trying to be accountable and we were trying to do our best because we truly believe this is how you're supposed to build church, but we get frustrated more and more with every year. And I remember Brian told me verbally that he is gonna build churches all around the world, and they will find a way how to build it, because God's law is higher than the law of the country.
When a church becomes this large and has this much power, what are they trying to achieve?
It's not a church.
There is a famous Bible verse where Jesus said, you cannot serve God and money. When your goal is to serve God and get rich at the same time, it can create all kinds of moral compromises. I'm a private investigator for Trinity Foundation, a nonprofit organization that specializes in the investigation of religious, financial fraud, theft, and excess, which means extravagant lifestyles of religious leaders. There are common characteristics we look for when we investigate religious organizations, and Hillsong exhibits certain red flags to us. In a typical church, it's going to be a nonprofit corporation. The church is going to have board of elders that makes the key decisions. With Hillsong, it's very different. They use limited liability companies to organize. They will have a manager that oversees the organization. So we are seeing these churches operating like a business. This is a list in the Virginia Secretary of State website. Hillsong Channel LLC, Hillsong Church USA, Hillsong College LLC, Hillsong Events LLC, Hillsong Global Technology Incorporated. He's containing risks so that if the church is sued for abuse or you lose a lawsuit for millions of dollars, the church property wouldn't be required to be sold just to pay that legal judgment. Hillsong has acquired more than 30 properties in Maricopa County, Arizona. This is where Hillsong has a church, and it's where Hillsong College is located. This one property listing that's over $9 million in 2021, and it's the most expensive property Hillsong has in Maricopa County. This is just one property. When you add 30 additional properties, that amount, it just keeps going higher and higher. A church filing as a limited liability company, that should be a red flag to anybody.
You have all these schemes within the scheme. This is an unfortunate part of the nonprofit, because you have institutions like Hillsong that are completely manipulating that. They want you to believe Brian Houston is doing this all for God and the kingdom. He's not. He's doing it to make himself very wealthy. Bobby and Brian Houston are absolute millionaires many times over, and they live a very luxurious life at the behest of their congregation.
We have seen across the world how churches have so often prioritized their own reputation and their own wealth, how they've put that before the interests of victims and survivors. And that was part of Hillsong's strategy.
I see a people so kingdom-minded that they will count the cost and pay whatever the price to see revival sweep this land.
Brian Houston tends to say little lingos, and that's like the lingo for the year. So there had been a lingo of, do you believe we get to do this? And that became like the biggest thing that volunteers would say every Sunday. You'd be exhausted, you'd be tired, people would have panic attacks in the break rooms. And everyone would just look at each other and be like, wow, do you believe we get to do this? And it was repeatedly said, and you start to believe it. Now that I look back, I'm like, damn, that they're trying to manipulate you into receiving and accepting the abuse that they're causing. That all stems from the top. The foundation of how Hillsong Church was founded on abuse. from his father.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth. Somehow, deep down in my stomach, I felt that this is not a good situation, that, it's not going to have a good ending.
For a good many years, Brian Houston has proven to be successful in terms of the systemic cover-up. But then, thankfully, we had the Royal Commission, and they really lifted the lid on exactly what went on in Hillsong. I've been in Parliament now for 11 years, and through the whole of that time, one of the core campaigns that I have taken on is to try and hold institutions account for institutional child abuse. Initially, a lot of the focus was on the larger traditional churches, the Catholic Church in particular. But then it became apparent that the concerns about systemic abuse, the concerns about systemic cover-up extended to other churches. Hillsong really came onto my radar a few years into this work, and it's really when I began talking to some of the people who had left Hillsong. They began telling me about the rumours about what had happened in the years during which Hillsong was being established in Australia.
Who was Frank Houston?
Frank Houston was the person who basically established Hillsong.
God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and with power.
He is the father of Brian Houston. He originally came from New Zealand, and over the course of the 1970s and early 1980s came to Australia and effectively established the initial church that over time became Hillsong. He is a man with a deeply, deeply troubling background.
Could you repeat after me, please? I do solemnly.
I do solemnly.
Sincerely and truly.
Sincerely and truly.
Declare and affirm.
Declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
In this Royal Commission.
In this Royal Commission.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
In or about the late 1960s, my family were quite heavily involved in the Assemblies of God Church. I was about 7 or 8 years old at the time. My family were personal friends with Pastor Frank Houston and his family. My family would often go to the different churches with him. We would go and see him before or after the meeting, and he would hug and kiss me in front of other people. We would sometimes go into an office alone where he would feel between my legs. I remember this happening at an evangelical camp at Windsor. On this trip, Pastor Frank and Brian were staying in my sister's room, which has a bunk bed. Pastor Frank would creep into my room late at night, nearly every night of the week. I would be asleep when he came in, and then I would wake up with him standing over me. I remember that when he was touching me inappropriately, I would be petrified and would lay very still.
That happened over a series of years, brutal sexual abuse of a young boy while he was establishing the church that eventually became Hillsong in Australia. Brett Sangstock was that young boy who Frank Houston abused.
He initially provided evidence anonymously and then has since revealed his identity out of frustration with the way in which the church has treated him, but also because there's so many more victims out there that were, you know, sexually abused by the founder of Hillsong.
He turned around and said to me that, you know, you're my golden boy and you're special to me and all these sort of things, which as an adult now I look back at, it makes me want to vomit.
I do know from Brett that he was repeatedly abused over years by Frank Houston. And eventually, as he became an older teenager, he disclosed to his mother, who was within the same religious circle.
After I told her about the abuse, my mother said words to the following effect: "You don't want to be responsible for turning people from the church and sending them to hell." I therefore did not pursue the matter any further.
More often than not, most of these victims don't step forward. And these offenders know that. They exploit that over and over and over again. But when they do step forward, there's a tremendous amount of guilt. This whole church that's been doing wonderful things for the kingdom, everybody's going to be looking at me going, wow, you're the source of why things began to implode. And that's really powerful stuff, especially for somebody whose life is inside the church.
In the late 90s, Brett's mother actually disclosed to a female pastor at her local church, Barbara Taylor, about what had happened to her son. She then goes and reports to male pastors higher up on the ladder and presumes that they'll do the right thing, presumes that they will follow the policies that's set out in the Assemblies of God manual for responding to pedophiles.
The only conduct I had was from Pastor Frank himself, who started calling me and my mother on a regular basis. When he called me, he would say words to the following effect: "I want to get together to discuss some sort of money as a compensation to you. I don't want this on my head when I stand in front of God."
Confess your sin to the Lord and he'll blot it out.
Frank appears to be very concerned with getting forgiveness before he dies. The concern is not very much about actual remorse. It's about not wanting to, an old man not wanting to face God as a pedophile that hasn't tried to make amends for his ways. Brett becomes too traumatized to be able to go through with this, but eventually meets with Frank. Frank insists on giving Brett $10,000 or promising Brett $10,000.
Nowhere near a fair payment or even a pretend to be a fair payment to Brett. To give you some idea of the contempt that Hillsong showed to this victim of Frank Houston, the final arrangements for the payment were negotiated at a McDonald's restaurant. The documentation, if you could call it that, was literally written on a napkin. The disrespect that shows to a survivor of abuse, for me, that still cuts through that utter disrespect they showed to Brett.
At this stage, I was nearly going into a panic. I just wanted to get away from the whole situation. I signed the napkin. Pastor Frank then said words to the following effect: "If there's any problem, contact me or Brian and you'll get your money."
Well, Brian Houston knew, and indeed the Hillsong Church's own records show that he and the governing council of Hillsong were very much aware and indeed discussed and debated the fact that Brett Sangstock had come forward and disclosed the abuse by Frank Houston. They wanted to protect the founder of Hillsong.
About 2 months after my meeting with Pastor Frank at McDonald's, I telephoned Brian Houston as I had not yet received any money from Pastor Frank. We had a conversation to the following effect. Me, what's happening with the payment I was promised? I agreed to forgive your father. Brian, yes, okay, I'll get the money to you. There's no problem. You know it's your fault all of this happened. You tempted my father.
At no point did any of the adults in his life, did any of the adults he disclosed it to, take his story, take his evidence to the police in Australia to try and seek some justice. Under Australian law, if you are given evidence or proof of a serious criminal offence, you can't just ignore it. You have an obligation to go and tell the authorities about it, to tell the police about the evidence of a serious criminal offence. And if you don't, you can be held to account with criminal charges.
I'm suggesting to you that when you made your statement, you tried to hide your knowledge of and involvement of the payment of $10,000 to
Well, the suggestion's wrong. No, I didn't do that.
Was there anything said about the little boy tempting Frank Houston during that meeting?
Absolutely, 100% not.
What I've consistently heard from abuse survivors from faith communities has been the following. The abuse that was perpetrated against me by the perpetrator was traumatic, and it's going to take a lifetime for me to process it and heal from it. But what was worse than that was the response of the very community that I thought was going to be my greatest advocate, but who turned their back on me. That I don't know if I'll ever heal from. That's really profound if you think about it. What it's saying is that the failed response of the church or faith community has a graver impact on the victim than the actual abuse itself.
In this Royal Commission.
In this Royal Commission.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
I know it appears to be of some pain to you, Pastor, but I wonder if you can assist us by saying what exactly he said the nature of the abuse was and to whom.
It was very clear that he was talking about a minor. And the reason I remember is because it hit me in a 10-second period in a wave, because I was like homosexual, getting my head around that before my consciousness went to, hold it a minute, we're not just talking about, homosexual, we're talking about paedophilia. So
yes.
I can still remember it very clearly.
So you understood it was sexual abuse?
Absolutely.
You understood it was an allegation made against your father?
Absolutely.
$1999, all of the top men in the inner circle, they had a meeting in the Qantas Businessman's Lounge. There are minutes, and it very explicitly says, it's very clear, we're not going to say a thing. We're going to focus on Frank's restoration, getting him back into ministry after 2 years, making sure he's looked after. And that was the meeting, and they signed off on it. They signed off on the cover-up.
My name is Loxie Gant. I am an institutional child abuse expert. I'm also the executive director and founder of the nonprofit Coalition for Institutional Child Abuse Prevention. All of these documents that I analyzed, I downloaded directly from the Royal Commission. This is from the Assemblies of God extremely confidential memo back in 2001. It says, Pastor Brian Houston received a serious accusation against his father, that it was some 30 years previous, and it should be clearly noted it was the first time he had received such allegations against his father. And Frank admitted to the failure with great remorse. It in no way identifies that Frank Houston is a pedophile. All of this language is so coded, and if we actually rewrote it, it would say Frank Houston admitted to the crime of raping a child.
Brian Houston says that he was very upfront with his church and that it was very clear and open from the beginning, and he absolutely wasn't. I was there for the announcement in 2002 that his father was kind of going to be stepping away from Hillsong. He described his father as having committed a serious moral failure, but he was in no way specific.
A moral failure to me is lying or adultery of some kind. Pedophilia is not a moral failure. It's a felonious criminal act.
Brian turned the whole speech back to focus on him and his family and how much they had been affected by this. There wasn't a moment of zero tolerance. This will never happen again in our church. We're going to pull out all stops to make sure kids are safe. There was none of that. There was, I'm okay, my kids are okay, but gee, this has been hard for us. Please stand and pray for us. And everybody stood and gave them a standing ovation and prayed for them. The victims didn't exist.
The records show that they had clear knowledge of the abuse of Frank Houston and never told the police. Hillsong's defence, if you can call it that, was twofold. They said, first of all, they're not responsible, because although the abuse was caused by the founder of Hillsong, they hadn't been legally established at the time, so they could wash their hands legally. And then they said, at some point after they became aware of it, they then stopped Frank Houston from preaching.
I knew he would never preach again from that moment. And to my knowledge, he never ever did.
Your own folly can take you out of fellowship, but nothing can separate you from the love of God. And you, and the little boy back there, two little boys, one bigger than the other. A couple of little kids up there, all quite a number. Oh, look at that. You've got a young church here on your hands, which is very wonderful. How old are you, son? 8. I'm 8 too, but it's 82. But what a fantastic young fellow he is. Curly hair, good looking, and it's not your fault you're good looking. So thank God you are. Yeah. Big, strong, healthy, happy.
So your dad was openly saying this stuff to kids in church during a sermon. Does that not suggest that not everyone knew he had confessed years earlier to being a pedophile?
You're actually telling me stuff I've never heard before.
The question is as to whether other people knew, because that's what's really raising...
Whether they did or not, it certainly wasn't my fault.
We've never had an explanation from Hillsong about how they allowed that to continue to happen. And there are repeated victims have come forward about him engaging in sexual abuse in New Zealand, but also when he travelled to Australia and he was establishing the church. When you think about the crimes of this man, Frank Houston, you know, the repeated crimes on children, the thought that he was ever allowed to have any position of authority after that, those crimes were brought to the attention of Hillsong, again shows another deep, fundamental institutional failure at the heart of this church.
it tends to be a common tactic where when there is historic abuse within a particular church or organization, and that person steps forward 10, 15, 20 years later, you will hear oftentimes from the church or organizational leader, in their response, they make sure to include the fact that it was 10, 15, 30 years ago. It's just this whole method of minimizing a criminal, traumatic act is part of a strategy.
The purpose of the Royal Commission is to find the truth. And then it allows authorities like the police to go out and piece together the evidence to bring a criminal prosecution. So there was always going to be a period of time of a police brief of evidence that could then go to court. So I waited for that police brief of evidence to happen. Brett Sangstock waited for the police brief of evidence to happen. And after 3 years, nothing had happened. And after 3 years, Brett approached my office and said, what can we do to try and get some accountability? So I raised it directly in Parliament. It's a slap in the face to the Royal Commission into institutional child abuse, and it's a slap in the face to the Australian laws. Still nothing had happened.
The Hillsong is access to places that most people don't normally get, and that access is power and it's political.
Hillsong is an extremely well-connected church. They have connections to the former police commissioner in New South Wales. I asked the police commissioner in parliamentary oversight hearings, what are you doing? When will we see a prosecution? And we got stonewalled and stonewalled and stonewalled. They just put the walls up and said, you can't prove your case.
The police commissioner, the highest appointed police executive in Australia, attended Frank Houston's funeral.
They also have very, very tight political connections to the former Premier of New South Wales, the Australian equivalent, if you like, of effectively a governor. And they have political connections to the Prime Minister of New South Wales, who's attended Hillsong events and been a guest speaker.
We thank you for Jesus and his love, and we pray that his love will be shown through your church forevermore. Amen.
It's part of their business model to be connected to business leaders, to be connected to political leaders, and to expand their reach. And you'd have to say it's a successful business model. I find it deeply confronting, but it's working for them.
Corruption, cover-up, re-traumatization, guilting the victim, hush money. This is pretty much a manual for how to cover up child sexual abuse. Brian Houston was integral in the cover-up and the victim shaming and the coercion of the ministry. He kept the brand above board. He kept moving forward. He kept planting churches in new countries and new spaces, coming to the US, having colleges. This is all a creation of Brian Houston in order to protect his family, but also to protect his brand.
The very gospel church leaders preach is all about a God who sacrificed himself in order to save the individual. What's lived out in these churches is the polar opposite.
Brian Houston, he's not protecting Hillsong Church, he's protecting the Hillsong empire.
Brian Houston's endgame is success and victory in this life and the next. They don't just want to save souls. Ultimately, it is about conquering territories bit by bit. And whatever it takes to achieve that. They are in a battle for everything. They really do believe that they need to conquer earth in order to make heaven on earth. Hillsong and Brian Houston's endgame is really about transforming society. And when you want to transform a society, you want to transform it in your own image.
But we've always been about equipping and empowering people to be influencers, to lead and impact, believing to raise kings and queens in all the walks and all the spheres. of society.
Brian Houston believe in this kind of 7 mountains of influence principle, where they feel it's really important to infiltrate like all these sections of society. And that's a very deliberate, premeditated thing.
The 7 Mountain Mandate is a modern Pentecostal Christian idea that says that believers should conquer all 7 mountains or spheres of life. So that is religion, family, education, business, arts and entertainment, media and government.
Well, what an honour to be standing in the White House, in the Cabinet Room, and to have just had the chance to pray for President Trump. Praise God for the opportunity.
They believe that the modern believer needs to conquer those 7 mountains as a good Christian and to create what they call kingdom now, which is creating the earth in God's image to essentially bring on the end times.
People who start groups that are these mega groups, to me, often have this need for global adoration. And they would love it if they could hear politicians quoting them. They would love it if there could be movies made about them within the entertainment industry. They would love it if there were corporations built around their name and their philosophy. They're not thinking about other people, even if what they're saying is that they have something that they think everyone else needs. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the only person they care about is themselves.
They truly believe that you're supposed to build a church for another human being. Brian said to me, you were building a church for me. And I said, no, I never built a church for you. I did it for Jesus. But he really believes that people build a church for him, which is dangerous.
Have you thought about maybe this church is too big, the problems reflect that, then it's time to downsize or take a different approach?
Yeah, I'm not sure a church can be too big.
No matter how much they get, it's not enough. And they want to get bigger and bigger, and they need to acquire more and more. They often are not able to be ever really satisfied.
The Bible says the more they persecuted them, the more they multiplied and grew. That's what I believe is going to happen for us. God is going to turn it around, and the more they persecute us, the more we will multiply and grow.
Pentecostalism is converting about 35,000 people per day. It's the fastest growing movement by conversion, certainly.
Would we tie Hillsong to that at all?
I mean, yeah, Hillsong is certainly converting people.
That it hurts to look back. Because yeah, I was used. They took someone who was vulnerable, who wanted just to fit in and find a family, who was in a new city, who wanted to thrive in this thing that I had been raised in, which was church. And they used that so that they could get more people through the doors that looked like me and who were going through the same things as me, to get the money out of them and the seats out of them and more volunteers out of them, more free labor. And if I were to go back and tell myself that, I probably would disregard what I was telling myself because I was so into it. I was so embedded in it. I wanted to believe it.
How does that make you feel when you think back to that?
Damn. I need a minute.
If you believe that people actually have a chance of like going to hell and you're worried about how your ass looks on Instagram, it's just so obscene. You're saying it is the most important thing above anything. I don't know why I'm getting emotional about it. It's like, if you believe all this is true and you're treating it like a game, that seems pretty foolish. And you're basically saying that you don't respect or appreciate how grave the stakes are, or like how large the stakes are.
My story to them doesn't matter because I was another volunteer. I was another person walking through the doors, and tomorrow they're gonna have someone else who's gonna be lonely and vulnerable and fall into that trap, and it's gonna be a vicious cycle.
When you look at a group like Hillsong, one of the maddening things that happens is that you have other people who have been involved long enough where they've learned how to run a group like this because they've had it modeled for them. And they think, oh, I can do that. I've honed my skills by watching. And then they start their own splinter group under their name, but still, it's the same organization. So what everyone watching this should be watching out for is if Hillsong no longer exists as Hillsong, it will still exist as something else.
Hillsong is just on an expansion plan. They want to keep expanding in Australia. Their reputation has taken a hit. And what's known now in Australia, I think, is causing them some anxiety. But they are hoping to spread their wings into foreign markets, get away from some of this history, and reach over into the United States. And you can't help but reflect on the history of Frank Houston in that regard. He stepped away from what happened in New Zealand to expand the market in Australia. Well, Hillsong is stepping away from Australia to expand the market in the United States. History has a horrible, horrible habit of repeating.
I think when you have an institution like Hillsong, where the person who's been in charge and founded it is toxic and doesn't really have the congregants' interests in mind, I think it can't fix itself. It's just kind of a top-down problem.
If we would be talking about Brian as a CEO or boss or businessman, we would not have this interview today. The reason why we have this interview because he does not act like Christian. He does not deal the situation with us in a Christian way.
I would judge Brian Houston on what he did, not what he said.
Nothing about Hillsong surprises me. You'll hear me say again and again, it's not Christianity, it's not a Christian church, it's not a church at all. It's a very evil plot to get a hold of your money.
Manipulation, control, bullying, abuse of power, and sexual abuse.
Misconduct, there was cover-ups, there was, all this stuff.
Corruption on almost every level.
You just have a system that's preying on people who were promised something else, but it's just the hypocrisy of it.
It was traumatic, and it could have taken my life if I stayed a minute longer.
If Brian was sitting here right now, what would you say to him?
You can run on for a long time, run on for a long time, run on for a long time. Sooner or later, God will cut you down. Sooner or later, God will cut you down.
I would tell Brian Houston that he needs to step down as a global senior pastor. If Jesus were to walk into a Hillsong church today, I don't know if he would be welcomed. He would probably flip the tables there too.
You have to get rid of the leadership because they are the ones that are creating the path towards problems.
Do you think that'll ever happen?
No. That would never, Brian Houston would never leave
It's futile, it's exhausting, it's circular. That's why I would have nothing to say to Brian Houston, because he wouldn't give a damn. They don't give a damn.
What more does Brian Houston need? Nothing. So what more does he want? Everything.
Like the scripture says, don't throw your pearls before swine. Am I calling him a swine? I think his spirit is swine. His spirit is swine.
It is foolish to make a god out of anyone. This isn't what the majority of Christians are doing, but the most famous ones are the ones that get to set the narrative. So it's sad, and it feels like people are going to continue to just accept that this happens, but there's still things that can be done to prevent it.
I would never pressure anyone to come forward, but I do believe that coming forward is the way to see change.
What would you say to somebody who has repeatedly, people have reached out for 40 years to ask this man for help, to ask him to be the basic Christian leader that he pretends that he is. And for 40 years, people have been cast aside. There's nothing to say to Brian Houston. There's nothing to say at all.